As I'm sure every other guy has done at some point, I didn't always properly close the plastic bags containing loaves of bread. Back in college I rarely did it. However, one incident changed how I felt, and now I make sure to never leave a loaf unsealed. It was during my sophomore year when I first noticed the strange occurrences. I had left a loaf of bread out on the counter overnight, and in the morning it was covered in a thin layer of green mold. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just tossed the loaf in the trash and went about my day. But then, the nightmare started. Every night I would dream of a dark, shadowy figure lurking in the corners of my room. It was tall and thin, with long, gnarled fingers that seemed to reach out towards me. I would always wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. At first I thought it was just stress from school, but then the dream started to change. The figure would whisper to me, telling me things that I couldn't quite understand. And then, one night, it spoke to me in a clear voice. "Feed me." I woke up with a start, my body shaking with fear. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the kitchen and grabbed another loaf of bread. I left it out on the counter, just like I had before. The next morning, the bread was covered in mold again, but this time, I didn't throw it away. Instead, I just left it there, hoping that it would appease whatever was haunting me. Indeed, the nightmare stopped after that, but every time I left a loaf of bread out, I could feel that shadowy figure watching me. It was as if it was feeding off the mold, growing stronger with each passing day. I never told anyone about what was happening. I was afraid they would think I was crazy. But I knew the truth. I knew that the mold was alive, and that it was hungry. Now I make sure to never leave a loaf of bread unsealed. I can't risk letting the mold grow, not when I know what it's capable of. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the whispers calling out to me. Feed me. I used to work in the world's one and only moldy bread museum. Yeah, it can be hard to believe that's a thing, but the job was actually pretty sweet. The museum was located in a small town in the middle of nowhere. It was a tiny, unassuming building, but it was packed full of history and knowledge about bread and its various forms of spoilage. I was the curator, which meant I was in charge of everything from the exhibits to the maintenance of the building. It was a lot of responsibility, but I loved it. I got to meet all sorts of interesting people, from fellow historians to curious tourists. Then one day, a new exhibit arrived. It was a loaf of bread that was said to be over 200 years old. It had been found in an old cellar, perfectly preserved by the cool, damp conditions. The bread was covered in a thick layer of mold, which had turned it a deep green color. The loaf was put on display in a glass case, and I was tasked with researching its history. As I delved deeper into the mystery of the moldy bread, I began to notice strange things happening around the museum. At first, it was just the little things. Objects would be moved around when no one was looking. Footsteps could be heard in empty hallways. But then, the incidents became more sinister. One night, I was working late when I heard a loud crash from the exhibit room. I rushed in to find the glass case shattered and the moldy bread missing. I searched the entire museum up and down, but there was no sign of the loaf or the culprit. From that night on, the museum was plagued by a series of strange occurrences. Lights would flicker, doors would slam shut on their own, and the moldy smell of the missing bread seemed to permeate the air. I began to suspect that the loaf of bread was cursed, that it had brought something dark and malevolent into the museum. But I couldn't prove anything, and my colleagues just laughed off my concerns. And then, one night, I saw it. A dark, shadowy figure looking in the corners of the museum. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, and its eyes glowed with a sickly green light. I knew then that I had to get rid of the cursed bread. I searched for it in the depths of the museum, finally finding it hidden away in a forgotten corner. I took the loaf and threw it into the furnace, watching as it burned to ashes. As the last of the moldy bread turned to dust, the shadowy figure let out a piercing shriek and vanished. The museum was quiet after that. No more strange occurrences, no more eerie footsteps. But I could never shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I quit my job at the Moldy Bread Museum soon after. I just couldn't bear to be surrounded by the memories of that cursed loaf. I also couldn't escape from the memories of the horror that it had brought into my life. I'd commonly go to the supermarket with my mom as a kid, and I actually have many fond memories from there. But there was one trip that stands out in my mind for all the wrong reasons. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, and my mom and I were doing our weekly grocery shopping. We were in the bread aisle, and I was looking at all the different types of bread, trying to decide which one I wanted. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a loaf of bread that looked different from the others. It was covered in a thick layer of green mold, and it seemed to be pulsating slightly. I was about to point it out to my mom, but before I could, the loaf started to move. No lie, it floated off the shelf and hovered in the air, growing larger and larger until it was the size of a person. The moldy bread monster let out a horrible screech and lunged at us. My mom grabbed my hand and we ran as fast as we could, but the monster was gaining on us. We turned down an aisle, hoping to lose it, but it followed us relentlessly. We ran through the store, dodging the monster's attacks and trying to find a way out, but it seemed like the monster knew the layout of the store better than we did, and it always managed to cut us off. Finally, we found ourselves in the freezer section. My mom pulled open the door to one of the freezers and pushed me inside, telling me to hide. She then turned to face the monster, determined to protect me. The monster let out another screech and lunged at my mom. I watched in horror as it enveloped her, its moldy body pulsing and writhing. I was beyond terrified, but I knew I had to do something. I grabbed a frozen turkey from the freezer and threw it at the monster. The turkey hit the monster right in the center, causing it to let out a loud shriek and disintegrate into a pile of moldy bread. Thank God my mom was okay, but she was shaken. We quickly left the store and never went back to that supermarket again. To this day, I still have nightmares about the moldy bread monster. I had been working as a bread inspector at the local bakery for a few years now. It was a pretty mundane job, but I enjoyed the routine and the people I worked with. However, that all changed one day when I came face to face with the moldy bread monster. It was a typical day, and I was going about my usual routine of inspecting the bread to make sure it met all the health and safety standards. I was in the back room, checking the loaves that had just come out of the oven. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the loaves was covered in a thick layer of green mold. It looked like it was moving, pulsating slightly. I was about to call over my supervisor when the loaf started to float off the table. Then it grew larger and larger until it was the size of a person. The moldy bread monster let out a horrible screech and lunged at me. I was so shocked that I couldn't move. The monster grabbed me and pulled me towards it. I could feel the cold, damp touch of the moldy bread against my skin, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. That's when my supervisor came into the room. He saw what was happening and quickly grabbed the fire extinguisher. He sprayed the monster with the extinguisher, causing it to let out a loud shriek and disintegrate into a pile of moldy bread. I was terrified, but I seemed to be okay physically. My supervisor called the police, and they came and took the remains of the monster away. They told us that they had never seen anything like it before, and that they would be investigating further. After that day, I never went back to the bakery. I just couldn't shake the feeling that the moldy bread monster was still out there. And deep down, I knew that it would be waiting for the right moment to strike again. I was ecstatic when I finally managed to snag an NVIDIA RTX 4090. It was the latest and greatest graphics card, and I had been waiting for months to get my hands on one. I couldn't wait to finally get it home and start gaming. When I got back to my apartment, I eagerly opened the box, but as soon as I saw the card, I knew something was wrong. It looked off somehow. The plastic casing was a strange green color, and it seemed to be pulsating slightly. However, I shook off my suspicions and plugged the card into my computer. I started up a game, but the graphics were terrible. The textures were all wrong, and the frame rate was choppy. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew stronger. It was the unmistakable smell of moldy bread. I looked down at the card and saw that it was covered in a thick layer of green mold. I was horrified. I had spent a fortune on this card, and it was made of moldy bread? I tried to pull the card out of my computer, but it was stuck. The moldy bread had somehow fused with the motherboard, and I couldn't get it out. That's when the card started to grow. It grew larger and larger, until it was the size of a small person. The moldy bread monster let out a horrible screech and lunged at me. I was frozen in terror, and then the monster grabbed me and pulled me towards it. I could feel the cold, damp touch of the moldy bread against my skin, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. That's when my roommate came into the room. He saw what was happening and quickly grabbed the fire extinguisher. He sprayed the monster with the extinguisher, but it wasn't enough. By some miracle, I left out a few cans of compressed air, and that actually was enough. The monster let out a loud shriek and disintegrated into a pile of moldy bread. I just stood there, stunned. My roommate called the police, and they came and took the remains of the monster away. One of them suggested that this was going to be studied in some kind of lab somewhere, but I have no idea what the outcome of that investigation was. After that day, I never bought anything online again. I just couldn't shake the feeling that the moldy bread monster was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. However, I did manage to get an RTX 4090 in a store, and my gaming experience has never been better.